May 27, 1942. On that morning, a grenade detonated in Prague. Of all the high-ranking Nazis the Allies could have killed, they chose him. They ignored Hitler, they bypassed Himmler and Goebbels, they focused entirely on Reinhard Heydrich. This single decision cost over 5,000 innocent people their lives. Why was he the target? At first glance, just another officer, but in reality, the most dangerous man in Europe. This remains the only time the Allies successfully assassinated a top-ranking Nazi official. The mission was called Operation Anthropoid. The story of why they did it, how they executed the plan, and the brutal aftermath is darker than most historical records suggest. Events accelerated quickly after the target was identified. To understand the choice, look at the hierarchy. Reinhard Heydrich was not a typical bureaucrat. He was the third most powerful man in the Third Reich. He sat directly behind Hitler and Himmler. He held the title of Chief of the Reich Security Main Office. This gave him absolute control over the Gestapo, the SS intelligence service, and the entire Nazi security apparatus. He held the keys to every prison and the files on every citizen. But his real claim to infamy was more specific. He was the principal architect of the final solution. January 20th, 1942. 4 months before the grenade exploded in Prague, Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference. The meeting took place in a luxury villa outside Berlin. It lasted only 90 minutes. In that hour and a half, Heydrich coordinated the systematic murder of 11 million European Jews. The footage of the villa shows a calm lakeside setting, but inside, the attendees discussed logistics, transportation schedules, and gas chambers. No one objected. Not a single person in the room raised a protest. The meeting ended. The camera records nothing from the private aftermath, but the logs are clear. Heydrich sat by the fireplace with his deputies. He smoked cigars. He drank brandy. According to later testimony, it was rare to see the normally cold and austere Heydrich enjoying himself. He was a man of stone. But that night, he had reason to celebrate. He had just secured total control over the largest genocide in human history. He was no longer just a general. He was the manager of industrial death. The Allies saw this. They knew his value to the regime. There was no turning back. The Butcher of Prague. This was the name given to him by the local population. Even among the high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, he was considered exceptionally cold. Heinrich Himmler described him with 4 words: the man with the iron heart. September 24, 1941. On this date, Adolf Hitler appointed Reinhard Heydrich as the acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Today, we know this land as the Czech Republic. Heydrich did not waste time. 3 days. That is all it took for the first wave of blood. He arrived in Prague and immediately ordered the execution of 92 people. The killing did not stop there. Within several months, the Gestapo arrested between 4,000 and 5,000 Czech patriots. Of that number, 400 to 500 were executed. Heydrich was efficient. He was brutal. He was transforming the territory into a model Nazi colony. Why did the Allies target Heydrich instead of a higher-ranking official? It seemed more logical to kill Hitler or Himmler. But the reality was different. The decision was born from political desperation. By late 1941, the situation in Czechoslovakia was unique. The country lived under German occupation, but the streets remained silent. Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece had active underground armies fighting back. In Prague, there was virtually no visible resistance. The territory was calm. Czech factories were working at full capacity to supply the German Wehrmacht. Thousands of workers produced shells, tanks, and rifles. Under Heydrich's rule, industrial production actually increased. The footage from the era shows the truth. Workers are at their benches. The streets are clean. There are no riots. To the outside world, it appeared that the Czech people had accepted their fate. This silence was a problem for the government in exile. London needed a sign of defiance. They needed a symbol of resistance that the world could see. Heydrich's success was his own death warrant. His efficiency had become a threat to the Allied cause. There was no turning back. Plans for Operation Anthropoid began. London, 1941. Edward Benz sat in his office, watching his nation's reputation disappear. At every Allied summit, the statistics were the same. Czechoslovakia ranked dead last in active resistance efforts. The reports were blunt. The Czechs were working in factories, producing German tanks and staying quiet. Benz felt the pressure. He feared that if his people did not bleed now, the Allies would ignore Czech borders during post-war negotiations. A passive nation had no seat at the table. He needed a shock, not a small act of sabotage or a leaflet campaign. He needed a strike that would echo across the globe. The objective was clear: prove the Czechs were fighting. He needed international headlines and Allied sympathy. The plan took shape. He would not target a Nazi in Berlin. That was impossible. He would kill a high-ranking official in Prague, in the very heart of the occupied territory. The British Special Operations Executive, or the SOE, joined the operation. They saw three strategic advantages. First, the assassination would prove that no Nazi leader was untouchable. Second, removing the chief of security would paralyze German intelligence operations. Third, it would serve as a spark. If the Czechs could kill a giant, every resistance cell in Europe would find new courage. But who was the target? Initially, the planners looked at Karl Hermann Frank. He was the deputy and a brutal local administrator. But the SOE and Benz wanted a bigger prize. They turned their eyes toward Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was not just a bureaucrat. He was one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. He had just chaired the Wannsee Conference, the meeting that organized the Holocaust. He was the acting ruler of the Czech territories, known as the Hangman of Prague. The decision was made. Heydrich was the target. He was dangerous, but he had one fatal flaw: arrogance. This trait would seal his fate. The security chief felt so superior that he ignored basic safety protocols. Hitler had recently given Heydrich 3 direct orders for his own protection. These orders were specific. The footage from the era shows the reality. Heydrich traveled in an open-top car. He moved without an armored escort. He believed the Czechs were too broken to strike back. He was wrong. 3 security protocols were mandatory. Use an armored vehicle. Travel with a heavy armed escort. Vary the driving route every day. Reinhard Heydrich ignored all 3. He drove through the streets of Prague in a green open-top Mercedes-Benz without a single bodyguard. Every morning, the car followed the exact same path. He believed he was untouchable and beyond the reach of any resistance cell. That arrogance became his death sentence. October 1941. Czech intelligence chief František Moravec began the selection process. He looked at 2,000 Czech soldiers living in exile in Britain. He chose 2 men: Josef Gabčík, a Slovak; Jan Kubiš, a Czech. The British Special Operations Executive moved them to the rugged terrain of Scotland. They trained there for months. The curriculum was narrow: weapons handling, plastic explosives, survival techniques in occupied territory. The mission received a name: Operation Anthropoid. In Greek, the word means having the form of a human. December 28, 1941. A Halifax bomber dropped them into the dark over Czechoslovakia along with 2 other teams. The drop was a disaster. The pilots missed the landing zone. Equipment was lost in the snow. Gabčík injured his foot upon landing. They had to seek out the local underground resistance. The locals were paralyzed. They knew an assassination would trigger a wave of mass executions. At first glance, a professional operation, but in reality, a desperate gamble. By the spring of 1942, the mission was collapsing. Other parachute teams were caught. Some were executed on the spot. German security tightened around every checkpoint. The resistance leaders in Prague sent urgent coded messages back to London. They begged the government to cancel the mission. They feared the reprisals would destroy the entire nation. But London did not stop. The command was reinforced. Kill Heydrich at any cost. Events accelerated. a new intelligence report reached the assassins. Heydrich was preparing to leave Prague for a high-level post in occupied France. If he left the city in triumph, the mission would be a total failure. There was no more time for planning. They had to act immediately. The footage from the era shows the target's route, a sharp hairpin turn in the Liban district. The car would have to slow down to a crawl. This was the spot. There was no turning back. 10:30 in the morning. This was the moment of the strike. Every day, Reinhard Heydrich followed the same predictable route through Prague. His dark green Mercedes 320C would slow to a crawl at a sharp hairpin turn in the suburb of Liban. The curve sat right near the Bulovka hospital. The assassins studied this vulnerability for weeks. They knew the car would be unarmored. They knew the roof would be down. May 27, 1942. Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík waited at the tram stop. They stood among ordinary civilians. A third operative, Josef Valčík, took a position further up the road. He held a small pocket mirror. When the sun reflected off the glass, it was the signal. The target was approaching. Why did Heydrich travel without an escort? He believed his presence alone inspired enough fear to protect him. It was a calculation that would cost him his life. The green Mercedes appeared. It began its slow rotation through the curve. Gabčík stepped into the street. He threw off his raincoat and leveled a Sten submachine gun. He pulled the trigger. Silence. The weapon jammed. A single faulty round rendered the British-made gun useless. The footage in the mind's eye. Gabčík stands frozen in the middle of the road. Heydrich looks directly at him. The hangman of Prague does not flinch. At this point, the driver could have floored the accelerator. They could have escaped the kill zone in seconds. But Heydrich chose pride over survival. He ordered the driver to stop the car. The Mercedes screeched to a halt. Heydrich stood up in the passenger seat and drew his Luger pistol. He wanted to kill the assassin himself. This was his fatal error. Kubis saw his opening. He pulled a modified anti-tank grenade from his bag and hurled it at the stationary car. He missed his aim. The grenade did not land inside the vehicle. It struck the outer edge of the rear wheel and detonated. The blast was violent. Shrapnel shattered windows and tore through the metal body of the Mercedes. At first glance, the attack failed. Heydrich climbed out of the wreckage, gun in hand. He pursued his attackers on foot before collapsing. He appeared to have only minor wounds. But the reality was different. The explosion had turned the car's interior into a cloud of lethal projectiles. The force of the blast drove metal fragments, road dirt, and horsehair from the seat upholstery deep into Heydrich's back. These microscopic pieces of debris embedded themselves in his spleen. The most powerful man in occupied Czechoslovakia was not killed by a bullet or a direct hit. He was killed by the very luxury he sat upon. Bacteria from the horsehair caused systemic sepsis. His body rotted from the inside out. The butcher of Prague died 8 days later. Reinhard Heydrich did not die instantly. He stood up from the wreckage and drew his service pistol. He chased Josef Gabčík on foot for several meters, firing wildly before his strength failed and he collapsed onto the pavement. His driver, Klein, did not hesitate. He pursued Jan Kubis through the smoke until the assassin turned and fired, hitting Klein in the leg. Both assassins vanished into the chaos of the Prague streets. They were convinced the mission was a total failure. In their eyes, the target was alive, standing and fighting back. They retreated into hiding, believing they were dead men walking for a job they hadn't finished. The reality was hidden inside Heydrich's body. Jagged metal fragments and dirty upholstery fibers were already poisoning his system. Medics rushed him to Bulovka Hospital. The initial medical report was cold and clinical. One broken rib, a ruptured diaphragm, shrapnel embedded deep in the spleen. The surgeons were cautiously optimistic. Heydrich remained conscious and stable for several days, but the countdown had already begun. 8 days later, on June 4, 1942, his condition shifted. Sepsis took hold. Bacteria from the debris in his wounds entered his bloodstream. He died in agony. He wasn't killed by the direct force of the blast, but by infected horsehair stuffing from the seat of his own luxury Mercedes. Hitler's reaction was explosive. He was not just mourning a loss, he was disgusted by the lack of security. In private, the Führer's words were biting. He mocked the idea of an elite official driving in an open, unarmored vehicle. He called it damned stupidity. He stated that a man as irreplaceable as Heydrich, exposing himself to such danger, was stupid and idiotic. But the public image had to be different. Hitler organized a massive, elaborate state funeral in Berlin. The footage shows the high command in full-dress uniform. Hitler personally placed the German Order and the Blood Order medal onto Heydrich's funeral pillow. It was a display of peak Nazi pageantry. Then, the mourning ended. The orders for revenge were issued. There was no turning back. 10,000 people. That was Hitler's first demand. He wanted 10,000 randomly selected Czechs executed immediately. But his advisors stepped in. They pointed to the factories. Random massacres would disrupt war production. They needed a different approach. Targeted reprisals became the new strategy. This wasn't about justice, it was about a signal. The Gestapo began the work. They used systematic torture on resistance members. On June 13th, the pressure broke a man named Karol Czurda. He was a Czech paratrooper. He wasn't a hero. He was a man terrified for his family. He walked into a Nazi office and betrayed his comrades. He gave up the location of the assassins. Gabčík and Kubis were not alone. 5 other resistance fighters were with them. They had moved into the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague. It was a stone fortress in the middle of the city. On June 18th, the trap snapped shut. 800 SS and Gestapo troops moved in. They blocked every street. They took positions on the rooftops. The battle began at dawn. It lasted for 6 hours. The resistance fighters were trapped, but they fought back from the choir loft in the nave. Eventually, the survivors retreated. They went down into the cold, dark crypt beneath the church floor. The Germans did not want to go down there. They used tear gas. They fired submachine guns through the ventilation slats. Then, they brought in the Prague Fire Brigade. The plan was simple: drown them. The Germans pumped thousands of gallons of water into the crypt. The water rose. The paratroopers tried to push the hoses back out with wooden poles. Finally, the SS used explosives to blast a hole in the concrete. The resistance fought until the end. 7 men held off a force of 800. They killed 14 SS soldiers and wounded 21 others. The odds were 100 to 1. But the defenders ran out of bullets. They had one choice left. The sound of 7 final shots echoed in the flooded basement. They committed suicide rather than face the Gestapo's torture racks. Gabčík and others swallowed cyanide capsules as the water reached their chests. The betrayal was complete. Karol Czurda did not just receive a reward, he collected 1 million Reichsmarks. But the Nazis gave him more than money. They gave him a new life. They wiped away his Czech history and gave him a German identity. He became Karl-Heinz Gerhardt. The church still bears the bullet holes today. Thus ended the hunt for the assassins. Karl Gerhardt. That was the new name the Nazis gave him. They provided him with German nationality and a German wife. She was the sister-in-law of a high-ranking Gestapo official. The transformation was complete. The Gestapo used him as a walking trap. Czurda would pose as a British intelligence agent. He entered safe houses and gained the trust of resistance members. Once he identified the targets, he signaled the police. The Gestapo moved in immediately. The footage from the era shows the aftermath. Hundreds of Czech citizens were arrested and executed because of his reports. He didn't stop until the war ended. 1947. Czurda stood trial for high treason. The prosecutor asked how he could betray his own friends. Czurda showed no remorse. He looked at the court and spoke clearly. He allegedly said that anyone would have done the same for 1 million marks. April 29, 1947. At Pankrak prison, the executioner pulled the lever. Czurda was hanged. But the damage was already done. Why did a whole village have to die? The answer is an absurdity. The Nazis needed a target for their revenge. They tortured prisoners and searched for any connection to the assassination. They found one. It was based on a total lie. A man named Václav Zihar had been having an affair. When he decided to end the relationship, he wrote a breakup letter to his mistress. He wanted to sound important. He wanted to sound dangerous. He claimed in the letter that he was involved in the hit on Heydrich. He had nothing to do with it. A factory owner intercepted the message. He handed the letter to the Gestapo. Based on this fake claim in a breakup letter, the Nazis chose their target. They selected the village of Litis for total annihilation, June 10, 1942. German forces arrived. They surrounded Litis, a small village of 500 people located 12 miles from Prague. The soldiers moved with mechanical precision. The sound of firing squads filled the air. They shot every male over the age of 14. 173 men and boys died in the dirt. The women were rounded up and deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The village was erased from the map. Buildings were burned. The ground was plowed over. There was no mistake. It was a calculated massacre based on a lie. 81 children were selected. German doctors examined them for specific Aryan features. Those who passed were sent to German families for forced adoption. Those who failed faced a different fate. Nazi guards loaded 81 children into gas vans at the Chelmno extermination camp. None of them survived the journey. The village of Litis was next. Soldiers systematically burned every building to the ground. They used heavy explosives to level the ruins until only dust remained. They rerouted the stream and filled in the lake. They wanted to erase the village from the map and from human memory. June 24, 1942. The village of Leziki met the same end. SS units surrounded the perimeter. They shot all 33 adults on the spot. The children were rounded up and deported to concentration camps. Bishop Gorazd watched the massacre from hiding. As leader of the Orthodox Church, he had provided the assassins with a sanctuary. He decided to turn himself in to save his subordinates. He wrote a direct letter to the Nazi authorities. The letter stated, "I and I alone am responsible." The Gestapo did not care. They executed Gorazd along with his priests. The torture chambers were active day and night. The Gestapo used every method available to break the resistance members. No one spoke. No names were given. Marie Moravkova, the mother of a resistance fighter, saw the secret police approaching. She swallowed a vial of cyanide before they could reach her. The Nazis responded by executing her entire family. 1,300 Czechs died in the immediate wave of executions. This was only the beginning. Thousands more were loaded onto trains and sent to Mauthausen. The conditions in the camp were lethal. Hard labor and starvation killed those the firing squads missed. The numbers tell the story. Historians estimate the total death toll of the Second Heydrichiad at over 5,000 people. 5,000 lives taken to avenge one Nazi official. Was Operation Anthropoid worth it? Czech leaders asked this in 1942. Historians ask it today. The immediate military impact was non-existent. Heinrich Himmler took over Heydrich's duties immediately. Later, Ernst Kaltenbrunner took the permanent seat. The Nazi machine did not stop. A dark irony emerged from the bloodbath. The final solution actually accelerated after Heydrich was buried. Within months, 3 major death camps became operational: Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. The Nazis gave this mass murder project a name. They called it Operation Reinhard. It was a tribute to Reinhard Heydrich. His death did not halt the Holocaust. It provided a name for the genocide. The Czech resistance paid the ultimate price. The underground networks were dismantled. Gestapo raids wiped out the leadership. The movement was decimated. The cost of the mission was the total destruction of the local opposition.